Newspapers, get your newspapers. Marcus at it again.
Read all about it. Right at Melton. Red paints and rioting.
Get it here, folks.
White Swan to Red Eagle, Rutland Arms to the Red Sea, Piers rioting in Melton.
Here, before magistrate.
Trial starts today.
All rise.
We are assembled to hear the case against the most honourable Marquis of Waterford, Sir Frederick Johnston, Mr. Edward Hornier Reynard, and the Honourable Mr. Villiers, who stand accused of discreditable conduct, disgraceful writing, and assault. I call the first witness, John Woodcock, the tollkeeper. Would you give your account of the happenings of the night of the April 6th?
It all started when I was awoken by the sound of shouting and banging outside my house. The men were shouting "Gate!" So I ran downstairs and tried to open my front door, I did. But the blighters had boarded it shut they had, so I went back upstairs to look out the windows. It was pitch black and I couldn't see much. They were boarded up too.
You boarded shut your own windows?
No, the men had boarded up my windows while I was asleep. So I thought, I'm not having this. So I grabbed my gun and jammed it through the borders. But I forgot my gunpowder, didn't I?
I see. How many men were there?
I couldn't be certain, but I reckon about 5 or 6 maybe.
Did you recognise any of the men?
I recognised their voices, I did. It was the men I refused earlier, I did. Too far into their cups they were. They had been at the Crowston races they had.
Who exactly did you refuse entry to?
The Marquis of Waterford and Lord Althorpe, I think, sir.
And do you think that Waterford was amongst these drunkards that returned?
Yes, sir.
Right, Mr. Woodcock, you may leave. I call the next witness, Dick Christian, to the stand. Good morning, Dick. Thank you for coming today. Now, how did the defendants get hold of your red paint?
Well, the Marquis, sir, he came and asked me for it, so I gave it to him. I even let my boys carry it for him.
Are you in the habit of giving out red paint to strangers?
Well, he paid for it and asked for it, and it's not really my place to be asked questions of a lord, sir.
So why were you up so early in the morning?
I was tending to a sick horse, sir. He must have seen my candlelight, sir. But after he came in, sir, I had to go back to my best, so I didn't see him leave.
What happened next?
Well, I heard the racket coming from the street, sir, so I stuck my head out to see the Marquis throwing red paint around, all over the street, sir.
Well, which buildings were painted?
Yours, sir, and Mr. Berridge's door, sir.
Did you see them doing anything else?
Well, they were breaking a few plant pots, sir, and hassling the neighbours, and there was nae a door that still had its knocker in the morning.
Well, it seems that your red paint is responsible for all of this. Are you in the habit of allowing your boys to get involved in such antics?
If I'd realised what they were going to do, sir, I would never have let my boys help them.
And why didn't you try and stop them or call the watch?
Well, no, sir. Sorry, sir, I didn't want to get involved, sir. I had an early morning of the hunt the next day, sir.
Thank you, Dick. You may go. I call my next witness, Miss Gray. Miss Gray, what can you tell us about the happenings on the night in question?
I was rudely awoken by a loud bang on the door. I thought we're all going to be murdered in our beds. I was so scared. My nerves were shot.
Now, Miss Gray, please just tell me what occurred.
I looked out the window and there were these horrible men ripping off my door knocker and running down the road with it. It was so awful. My nerves will never be the same.
Did you recognise any of these men?
No, it was that hunting lot. They'd just come over for the races. They were running around, spilling red paint everywhere.
More red paint? Did you see anything else?
They ran a bit further down the street and started attacking this poor caravan, a gypsy caravan. It was really awful. But they shouldn't have been allowed to park there, you know. They'd been parked there for days on end. They were rocking it backwards and forwards. They were really rocking it.
Focus, woman. Did they turn this caravan over?
Not quite, but my nerves are shot. They really are.
Well, thank you very much, Miss Gray. That's quite enough. You can go. I call my next witness, Night Watchman Hugh Barnes. Could you please give your accounts of the night in question?
Well, I was doing my regular rounds in the marketplace around 3 in the morning like I usually do, when maybe 5 or 6 gentlemen entered. A rather stout gentleman asked what was hanging at my side. I tell him it's my rattle, and he tried to take it from me, but he'd obviously been drinking, so it wasn't hard to push me away from me.
Do you see this rather stout gentleman in the courtroom today?
No, I don't, Your Honour.
Well, continue with your account.
So then he went and joins another 4 gentlemen, where they approach a caravan on Burton End, and he persisted to try and turn it over, rocking it back and forth. My fellow watchman joined me in persuading them to think better of it, whilst they laughed and walked away down Burton End towards the bridge. Several other gentlemen helped another scale the Red Lion in, pulled down its sign and tossed it in the canal, before disappearing towards Lord Rooksbury's. They must have stayed there a good quarter hour before I was to see them again.
Thank you, sir. I believe we'll be hearing from you again later. I call Mrs. Priddy to the stand. Mrs. Priddy, could you please give your accounts of the night of the April 6th?
Well, Mr. Priddy insisted that we get to the ball at a rather unfashionable 9 o'clock. We were so thankful to be invited to the Countess of Wilton's end of the season ball. I must say, the ball was beautiful, the food was utterly divine. You would of course expect nothing less from the King and Queen of Melton. It was just perfect. The ladies were so finely dressed, so much French lace and silk everywhere. We were then to dine. The 6 courses were just splendid, and we go on to the dance.
Mrs. Priddy.
Gardiner danced 3 times with Mrs. Smith. It was so unexpected. She'd only lost her husband a few months ago. It was appalling.
Mrs. Priddy.
Then Mr. Errington slipped into the garden, and no one hears for him for a good few hours until we all said our goodbye.
Mrs. Priddy.
Forrester was making such a scene of himself. It was terrible. He'd obviously been drinking again.
Would you please refrain from talking about gossip and stick to the events which happened after this ball, if you please?
Well, I never. My husband and I decided to return home about 3:30 in the morning. Quite a respectable time. We were walking along Church Lane, because it wasn't that far from Egerton Lodge, and all of a sudden we hear these crashing of plant pots everywhere. We just assumed it was those lower people getting out of hand again. In that pub, it was always rowdy, that pub.
Mrs. Priddy.
That's all the time. It's an absolute disgrace, you know. That pub is just terrible.
Mrs. Priddy, please keep on topic.
As we go around the corner, we find that it's George Bishop's house that's been ransacked. It was terrible. Plant pots going everywhere, but his roses are his pride and joy. And he wins with them every year. Every competition we have, he always wins with his roses. They're just the most...
Mrs. Priddy.
Actually, no, they never compare to Mrs. Jones.
Mrs. Priddy.
Standing lilies.
Mrs. Priddy, what happened next?
We
Please.
saw those disgraceful gentlemen, and they were just throwing plant pots about. We heard Mr. Bishop call for the watch, waking all the neighbours that hadn't already been awoken by those silly young men, strutting around like they own the place. And they don't even live there. Those races cause such a riot every year. It's disgraceful. But the balls, on the other hand, the balls are just...
Thank you, Mrs. Priddy, thank you. Do you recall anything about red paint?
We could see them splashing red paint everywhere, but we had to go closer because we lived just over the road from Mrs. Bishop, next to Mrs. Jones, and on the other side of Mr. Peters, who was a lovely neighbour, by the way. We never had any trouble with him. All of our neighbours are...
Mrs. Priddy, the paint.
We see them splashing red paint everywhere, and I was just walking innocently home, never minding anybody. I never mind anybody, you know. I never get in anybody's way. I never do anything to annoy anybody. And then all of a sudden, my beautiful new primrose silk dress was covered in that dreadful paint. I brought that dress especially for the occasion. There was no match for the Countess of Wilton's beautiful gown. The embroidery was just exquisite, but it was still my pride and joy.
Thank you, Mrs. Priddy. Have you got anything else to add which is relevant?
Yes, of course.
Please keep to the topic in hand.
After I was shocked by the disgusting splashing of red paint all over my new silk dress, well, after that I saw them climb the white swan. That beautiful white swan was turned into a red eagle. It had only just been repainted last week. I remember those balls we used to have in there. Of course, they were no match for the Countess of Wilton's soirees, but they were still a nice and genteel evening, I must say. But they had covered the whole thing in that dreadful red paint. My maid still hasn't managed to get the red paint out of my lovely silk dress. It's absolutely ruined. Ruined, I tell you. I cannot believe that they would do that. You boys should be ashamed of yourselves. Whatever would your mothers think?
Mrs. Priddy, that is enough. Did you witness anything else which is relevant to these hearings?
We did see them attack Hugh Barnes, that lovely watchman that always walks around town. We always see him on our way home from those lovely balls that we always attend, that we always get invited to. He saw him brutally attack the poor boy. He was just doing his job, and then all of a sudden 4 men pushed him down and covered him in red paint. The poor boy, it was just terrible.
Thank you, Mrs. Priddy. I think that'll be all now. I wish to hear Hugh Barnes again, please. Would you have him return? Mr. Barnes, could I please have the rest of your account of the night?
So I was continuing my rounds near the marketplace when at about 3:30 I hear plant pots smashing down Church Lane and then Mr. Bishop shouting for the watch. So obviously I ran straight there and there were 7, maybe 8 men wrecking the place, including the Marquis, sir. There was soil and paint everywhere. I decided enough was enough. So I snatched a paintbrush from Mr. Reynard, and that's when 4 gentlemen rushed me and knocked me to the ground. They proceeded in kicking and hitting me, and they even pulled the paintbrush out of my fingers so hard they sprained my hand, and they upturned the whole can of paint over me, covering me head to toe in the god-awful stuff. Laughing, they just headed off towards King Street, but I was in no state to follow them, sir.
Thank you, Hugh Barnes. You may go. I call my final witness, Constable Campion, to the stand. So, Constable, can you please give me your account of the evening in question?
Around 4 in the morning, I was woken by Watchman Wright with reports of gentlemen up to all manners of mischief in the town. He was blathering on about Barnes being covered in blood.
Speak up, man. What's this about, a flood?
Blood, sir. Wright thought Barnes was covered in blood, sir. So when Wright pointed out Reynard as the man he had seen attack Barnes, I grabbed him by the collar.
What are you going on about?
Collar. I grabbed him by the collar, but he slipped my hold and ran off towards Tebb's corner. I tackled him and brought him down, and with the help of Wright and Barnes, who was covered in paint and not blood, we dragged him off towards the bridewell. I could hear the Marquis shouting and hollering in the marketplace, so I dropped my keys in Mr. Black's garden, hoping to find them again later.
Did you say garden? You really must speak up, man.
I thought it would be safer not to be caught with them, sir, especially as 9 or 10 other people were advancing on the bridewell. I could hear the Marquis yelling that he was determined to get his friend released.
Pray tell, just how did he plan to get his friend released?
He demanded his release. I responded saying I couldn't until I heard from a magistrate. Well, 2 of them did say that they were magistrates and would do. I replied that it would have to be a Melton magistrate, and I knew that they weren't from Melton, and there was no proof that they were who that they said that they were.
Quite right. Proceed.
I was grabbed and my pockets and searched for the keys. I tried to fight them off, but there was just so many, and Mr. Villiers was blocking the alley holding our own staff.
How the heck did they get hold of your staff?
During the set 2 in the marketplace, I guess.
No, I don't want to hear more about Miss Priddy's dress.
Anyway, sir, then the Marquis grabbed an iron bar and held it right to my face. He said if I didn't give him the keys, he would strike me in the head.
A bed? How has that got anything to do with anything? Please keep the matter in hand. I swear, man, you're as bad as that infernal woman we had in here earlier.
When this didn't work, he used the iron bar to smash 3 of the 4 locks to get to Reynard, but he couldn't get through the 4th one.
What happened next?
Other gentlemen had cornered Mr. Henley, and fearing for his very life, he handed over his keys, and they were all away into the night.
Thank you, Constable Campion. You may leave. Well, gentlemen, I think there's enough evidence to bound you over to the next assizes, for you really did paint the town red.
So here we are at Melton Carnegie Museum with our young researchers. You've just seen the film. Here's what happens next.
On the second night, the Marquis and another bunch of friends became drunk in Lord Rokesbury's club, where they were staying for the end of the season races. After their time in the club, they went out into the town, hoping to cause more mischief. Because of the happenings of the night before, the men of the town had decided that extra watchmen should be put on in case anything else to do with the Marquis were to happen again. The Marquis and his friends proceeded to act in a rowdy manner. They shouted and screamed, but they were soon stopped by the extra policemen. And a good job too, because if they weren't, we may have seen another night of havoc.
After the first night, the Marquis and his friends paid anybody with damages compensation of up to £100. This was so they wouldn't testify against him. Even though William Campion and Hugh Barnes were also paid, they still testified against the Marquis. It also turns out the magistrates didn't want to bring the Marquis and his friends to trial of principle of ranking. The jurors were also brought off before it could come to the trial in Derbyshire. That's why it took almost 18 months to appear in court.
In the end, the Marquis, Johnson, Villiers and Reynard were each fined £100. That's £4,000 today. That's not really a lot for each man to pay. They were also ordered to be imprisoned until the fine was paid, which was silly as not one of them had been in custody before the trial. It caused much debate across the nation, not only that the courts were forcing a peer to appear before them, something that rarely happened in history, but that they were punished in their words through the person, not through the person, which was so below what would have happened to a common folk.
They stood accused of discreditable conduct, disgraceful rioting and assault, not to mention the thefts, vandalism and assault on a constable. However, they only received a fine, whereas John Eaton in 1834 got 14 days in prison for one count of assault. Thomas Hobbes in 1837 got 6 months of hard labour for assaulting a constable, yet the Marquis and his men did far more and received a lot less.
So we already know the men got off lightly at the time, but what would they have gotten now? For starters, a fine for the vandalism and community service hours. At least 6 months in prison for the assault and 6 more months for the thefts. For assaulting a constable, Reynard would have received another 6 months just for covering Hugh Barnes in the red paint. Overall, they would have been facing at least a year in prison, with the Marquis more likely to receive 2 years because he was the leader and for threatening a constable with a visible weapon.
Did the saying, painting the town red, come from Melton Mowbray? Who knows? There are other theories, the Gaelic saying meaning red drunk, or from New York, where the saying was first printed 50 years later. We don't know, but it certainly makes a good story.